There exists a spot in this world where the line between paradise and inferno is razor-thin: Jerusalem. For thousands of years, humanity has spilled blood just to claim the right to bow down on this soil. But that insanity climaxed in 1099, a realm forged not by heritage, but by the sheer rage of belief. Western knights draped in the Crusaders crossed seas, and wastelands carrying steel to buy their redemption. They named it the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile palace of glass standing in the eastern Kilm, a wild fantasy of men trying to establish an outpost of the divine upon the ground. Yet the rules of history are crueler than any prayer. What is won by blood shall be lost by blood. If you look at a medieval map, specifically the famous Mapundi, you will notice something peculiar, something that defies modern geography but perfectly explains medieval psychology. The world is not a sphere floating in space. It is a flat disk, and right there in the dead center, the pinprick around which the entire universe revolves, is a single city: Jerusalem. For the people of the Middle Ages, this was not just a city. It was Theos, the navel of the world. It was the physical point where the divine realm of heaven bent down to kiss the dusty reality of earth. It was the location of the beginning and the end. It was here that God gathered the dust to create Hattin. It was here that Abraham raised his knife to sacrifice his son. It was here that Jesus Christ died, and it is here they believed that the world will eventually shatter into pieces on Judgment Day. But there is a dark cosmic irony to this city. Jerusalem, a name that translates to the city of peace, has witnessed more slaughter within its walls than perhaps any other settlement in human history. It is a place where stone is more valuable than flesh, and where the promise of eternal salvation has always been paid for with the currency of immediate violence. Imagine the sheer madness of it. A city perched on the dry, unforgiving Judean mountains. It has no great river like the Nile or the Tigris to sustain it. It has no natural harbor to feed it with trade. Strategically, it is a nightmare. Economically, it is a burden. Yet, for thousands of years, empires have bankrupted themselves and sacrificed generations of young men just to plant their flag on this pile of holy rocks. By the end of the 11th century, specifically in the year 1099, this obsession had curdled into something entirely new, something terrifying. Europe was not sending diplomats. It was not sending merchants. It was sending a migration of killers. They called themselves pilgrims, but they marched in armor. They spoke of love, but they sharpened swords. They were coming to liberate the grave of a man who preached nonviolence, and to do so, they were prepared to wash the cobblestones in an ocean of blood. This is not a fairy tale of knights in shining armor rescuing damsels. This is the story of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile, impossible state built on a foundation of corpses held together by fanaticism and doomed by the very geography it sought to conquer. Welcome to the paradox of the Holy Land. Welcome to the place where men go to find God and end up finding only the devil in themselves. In the year 1095 at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II did not just deliver a sermon. He unleashed a virus of the mind with two simple words: Deus vult, meaning God wills it. He convinced the nobility of Europe to abandon their castles, their lands, and their sanity to march into the unknown. What followed was not a military campaign in the modern sense, but a mass migration of the desperate and the deluded. Imagine a 3,000 miles death march from the lush fields of France to the scorching deserts of Syria. This was not a flight with in-flight meals. This was a trek through hell in ill-fitting shoes. They walked through the swamps of Hungary, climbed the jagged mountains of Anatolia, and crossed the arid plains of the Levant. Most of them were wearing chainmail armor weighing 30 pounds, effectively cooking themselves like lobsters in a steel pot under the merciless Middle Eastern sun. But the heat was a mercy compared to the hunger. By the time this ragtag horde reached the city of Mahara in the year 1098, the line between man and beast had vanished. The siege had dragged on, supplies were gone, and the Crusaders were reduced to walking skeletons. And here, in the shadow of the cross, occurred an event so horrific that even medieval chroniclers trembled to write it down. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres recorded with grim honesty, "In Mara, our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled." Let that sink in. The soldiers of Christ, the liberators of the Holy Sephilah, had resorted to cannibalism. They were eating the very people they had come to save or convert. This was the point of no return. When you have tasted human flesh to survive, you do not go back to being a normal farmer or a chivalrous knight. You become something else. By the time the survivors stood before the walls of Jerusalem in 1099, they were no longer human beings in the traditional sense. They were physically ruined, mentally shattered, and spiritually radicalized beyond all reason. They were gaunt, terrifying figures, their eyes burning with the madness of survivors' guilt and divine purpose. They were no longer men. They were biological machines of faith fueled by trauma and starving for redemption. They did not just want to conquer Jerusalem. They needed to devour it to justify the hell they had walked through. The city was not a prize. It was the only cure for their insanity. It is midday, July 15th, 1099. The heat is suffocating. The massive wooden siege tower, smelling of wet animal hides and vinegar, used to douse Greek fire groans against the northern stone walls. Suddenly a bridge lowers with a sickening thud. It is not a bridge to safety. It is a tongue of wood licking the face of death. The Crusaders do not walk in. They pour in like a broken dam of iron. The first sound is the clash of steel, but that is quickly drowned out by a sound much more primal, much more terrifying. The collective scream of a city realizing it is about to die. The slaughter that followed was not warfare. Warfare implies two sides fighting. This was butchery on an industrial scale. The Crusaders, fueled by months of starvation and religious psychosis, moved through the narrow, twisting streets of Jerusalem like human threshing machines. They did not distinguish between soldier and civilian, man and woman, old and young. To them, every moving object that was not wearing a cross was a weed in God's garden, and they were the skith. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, a man of the cloth who witnessed the horror with his own eyes, wrote words that have stained history books for 9 centuries. He described the scene inside the Temple of Solomon, known to the Muslims as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where thousands had fled for sanctuary. He wrote, "In this temple, 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive. Neither women nor children were spared." Later accounts would embellish this, claiming the horses waded in blood up to their bridles. While physically impossible, it was metaphorically accurate. The city was drowning in its own fluids, and then, as evening fell, a terrifying silence descended. The screaming stopped because there were no throats left to scream. Jerusalem had been cleansed. The Crusaders, their armor caked in drying gore, washed their hands and walked barefoot, weeping with joy to the church of the Holy Sephilah. There, amidst the stench of rotting flesh wafting in from the streets, they sang hymns of praise. They had liberated the tomb of Christ by filling the city with the dead. It was the ultimate blasphemy disguised as the ultimate act of piety. The holy city was now Christian, but it had lost its soul in the process. Thus was born the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But let us not be fooled by the heavy golden crowns and the holy titles. This was not a nation in the way France or England were nations. It was a military occupation disguised as a state. It was a tiny, fragile island of Christianity, besieged by a vast, angry ocean of Islam. It was a geopolitical anomaly, a transplant organ that the body of the Middle East would spend the next century trying to violently reject. The central tragedy of this kingdom lies in its very foundation, by slaughtering the inhabitants of Jerusalem in the year 1099. The Crusaders did not just commit a moral crime, they committed strategic suicide. They had seized the fortress, but they had murdered the workforce. They had captured the market, but they had killed the customers. They had won the land, but they had sown a harvest of eternal hatred that would eventually choke them. And so the great question that hangs over the next 88 years of history like a sword of Damocles is this: how does a kingdom survive when its foundation is built not on solid rock, but on the shifting, slippery bones of the dead? How do you build a home in a cemetery that you created? The silence that settles over a battlefield is often more terrifying than the noise of the fighting itself. On the morning of July 16th, 1099, Jerusalem was silent, save for the buzzing of flies. The city had been cleansed of its inhabitants, but now it was filled with something far more dangerous: the egos of the victors. The common soldiers were busy dragging corpses out of the city gates to burn in pyres that would smoke for days. But inside the palaces, the leaders of the Crusade were engaged in a different kind of butchery. They were carving up the political carcass of the Holy Land. It is a timeless irony of history that men who unite to kill for God will immediately turn upon each other when it is time to share the loot. The crusade was theoretically a spiritual mission, but now that the real estate had been acquired, the mask of piety slipped, revealing the ugly face of feudal ambition. Two distinct factions emerged from the blood mist, glaring at each other like wolves over a fresh kill. On one side stood the church, represented by the clergy who believed that Jerusalem should be a theocracy. In their eyes, this was the patrimony of Christ. It should be ruled by a patriarch, a pope of the East, with God as the only true sovereign, and the knights serving merely as armed janitors. On the other side stood the barons, the men of iron who had actually done the bleeding. They did not walk 3,000 m to create a monastery. They came to carve out kingdoms, to seize thefts, and to impose the feudal structures of France upon the sands of Judea. They wanted a king, and they wanted land. At the heart of this toxic deadlock was a rivalry that would make a Shakespearean tragedy look like a children's argument. In the red corner was Raymond of Toulouse. He was the oldest, the richest, and undoubtedly the most arrogant of the Crusade leaders. Raymond had the largest army. He had the favor of the Pope's representative. And in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, he had physically seized the Tower of David, the citadel that controlled the city. He walked with the swagger of a man who has already commissioned his own coronation portrait. He did not just want to be king. He assumed the crown was already his property. In the blue corner was Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke from Lower Lane. Godfrey was a different breed of animal. He was tall, strong, and undeniably pious, but politically he was seen as less ambitious, perhaps even a bit dull compared to the flamboyant Raymond. While Raymond was busy occupying the citadel and demanding oaths of loyalty, Godfrey was quietly securing the support of the lesser knights and the wavering clergy. The election that followed was not a democratic process. It was a backroom deal fueled by fear and resentment. The other nobles looked at Raymond of Toulouse and saw a tyrant in the making. They feared his wealth. They hated his arrogance. And they knew that if Raymond wore the crown, they would be reduced to mere servants. They needed an alternative. They needed someone strong enough to lead, but weak enough to be managed. They needed a compromise. And so the choice fell upon Godfrey. He was chosen not because he was the most brilliant strategist, nor because he was the most charismatic leader. He was chosen because he was the least hated option. He was the perfect political buffer. The barons reasoned that Godfrey was pious enough to appease the church, yet feudal enough to protect the rights of the nobility. Raymond, furious at being outmaneuvered by a man he considered his inferior, stormed out of Jerusalem in a huff, taking his troops with him, proving that in the Game of Thrones, if you cannot win the prize, you can at least try to burn down the stadium. Thus, Godfrey of Bouillon found himself standing alone at the helm of a ship that was already sinking. He had won the election, but his prize was a depopulated city, a hostile church, and a collection of allies who were already plotting his downfall. The crown was offered, but as we shall see, Godfrey was smart enough to look at the golden object and see the trap hidden within. In a world of peacocks, Godfrey of Bouillon was a warrior, while other leaders of the Crusade, like the flamboyant Raymond of Toulouse or the scheming Beyond, draped themselves in the stolen silks of the Orient and indulged in the complex political games of the Levant, Godfrey remained frustratingly, almost suspiciously simple. He was the second son of a count, a man raised not to rule but to fight. Before leaving Europe, he had done something that would make a modern financial advisor scream in horror. He sold his entire lordship, the castle of Bouillon, to the Bishop of Liege. He liquidated his legacy. This was not a man planning a return trip. He was a man buying a one-way ticket to salvation. Physically, he was the archetype of the Northern European knight. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of wheat, and a beard that likely housed the dust of 3 continents. But his true strength lay in his stoicism. In the chaotic, ego-drenched boardroom of the Crusade leadership, Godfrey was the quiet man in the corner, polishing his sword. He did not seek the spotlight, which paradoxically made the spotlight find him. And then came the moment that defined his legacy, a moment of political theater. So brilliant it is still debated by historians 9 centuries later. When the council offered him the crown of Jerusalem, expecting him to seize it with greedy hands, Godfrey stopped them. He looked at the golden object, then at the stone walls of the city, and delivered a line that was destined for immortality. "I will not wear a crown of gold in the place where my Savior wore a crown of thorns." It is a beautiful sentiment. It is pious, it is humble, and it is also one of the shrewdest political maneuvers in medieval history. Let us strip away the romanticism and look at the chessboard. By refusing the title of king, Godfrey instantly disarmed the church. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, a grumpy cleric named Debert, believed that the holy city should belong to God alone, administered by the priests. By calling himself a king, Godfrey would have declared war on the church. But by refusing the crown, he positioned himself as a humble servant, a mere employee of Christ. Furthermore, this act of humility was a slap in the face to his rival Raymond. How could Raymond demand to be king now? To do so would be to admit that he thought himself better than Jesus. Godfrey had weaponized piety. He had taken the moral high ground and fortified it so heavily that no one could touch him. Instead of king, he adopted the title Advocacus Sancti Sapori, the advocate or defender of the Holy Sulla. The genius of this title lies in its legal ambiguity. In medieval law, an advocacus was a layman who managed the estates of a monastery because priests were not allowed to spill blood or handle dirty money. By taking this title, Godfrey was essentially saying to the church, "Technically, you own the house. I am just the bouncer. But make no mistake, the bouncer holds the keys and the bouncer holds the sword." Godfrey secured absolute military command without triggering the constitutional crisis. He ruled as a king in all but name, proving that in the game of power, sometimes the man who refuses to sit on the throne is the one who stands tallest in the room. If the refusal of the crown was a masterstroke of public relations, the governance of the kingdom was a masterstroke of desperate improvisation. When the dust settled in the year 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon looked around and realized the terrifying arithmetic of his victory. The great Crusade army had evaporated. Most had sailed home to France or Italy, clutching their stolen relics and stories of glory. Godfrey was left with approximately 300 knights and 2,000 feet soldiers. Let us pause and appreciate the absurdity of those numbers. 300 men in heavy iron suits were attempting to govern a population of tens of thousands of Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Jews, all of whom viewed these unwashed northerners as barbaric invaders. It was not a government. It was a suicide pact, disguised as an administration. To survive, Godfrey could not simply copy the laws of Europe. He had to invent a new operating system for a state that existed in a permanent state of emergency. Thus began the oral tradition that would later be codified as the Assizes of Jerusalem. In Paris or London, the king was slowly becoming a figure of absolute authority, a man who claimed to rule by divine right. But in Jerusalem, the king could not afford the luxury of autocracy. He needed every single sword. If he offended a baron, that baron might pack up and leave, taking 10% of the kingdom's military strength with him. Therefore, the Kingdom of Jerusalem became a strange political experiment, a crowned republic of nobles. The power did not reside solely on the throne, but in the haute cour, or the high court. This was not merely a council of advisers, it was a parliament of armed shareholders. The king was merely primus inter pares, the first among equals. He could not make a law, levy a tax, or even march to war without the consent of his vassals. It was a political system designed to keep the king weak so that the unity of the knights would remain strong. But the most radical departure from European norms was in the laws of military service. In the feudal system of Europe, a knight was essentially a part-time soldier. His feudal contract usually stipulated that he owed his lord 40 days of military service per year. After those 40 days, he could literally wave goodbye to the king in the middle of a siege and go home to manage his harvest. It was a system built for seasonal squabbles, not total war. In the Holy Land, such a luxury was a death sentence. The enemy was not a neighboring count. It was the entire Islamic world. They did not take holidays, and so the assizes rewrote the social contract. In Jerusalem, the concept of the Ariban, or the general call to arms, was total. Every knight, every vassal, and every able-bodied man owed service 365 days a year. There was no going home. The harvest was war. The rent was blood. This legal structure created a society unlike any other. It was a state of permanent mobilization, a Spartan colony transplanted into the Middle East. It forced the Crusaders to become the most lethal, professional, and exhausted warriors on the planet. They lived in their armor. They slept with their swords. And they created a legal system where the only crime punishable by immediate exile was cowardice. Because in a kingdom of 300 men, one coward is a hole in the dam that can drown everyone. Godfrey of Bouillon spent his final months doing what he did best, trying to expand the breathing room of his suffocating kingdom. He marched his tiny army to the coastal city of Ars, desperate to secure a port. But the architect of the Kingdom of Jerusalem did not meet his end on the tip of a Saracen spear, nor was he crushed by a falling stone from the siege tower. He died the most dangerous death of the Middle Ages. He ate dinner. Legend tells us that after receiving the submission of the Emir of Caesarea, Godfrey was given a piece of fruit. Some say it was a poisoned apple. Others say it was simply a bad case of typhoid fever contracted from the filth of the campaign. Whatever the biological agent, the result was a slow, agony, Zin collapse. The man who had walked 3,000 miles and stormed the walls of hell was defeated by a microbe. On July 18th, in the year 1100, exactly 1 year and 3 days after the conquest of the city, Godfrey of Bouillon died in Jerusalem. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sophia at the foot of Calvary. His death feels like a punchline in a cosmic joke. It seems that God, in his infinite wisdom and dark sense of humor, decided that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had had enough piety for 1 century. He called the humble janitor home and left the keys to the asylum on the table. Godfrey leaves behind a legacy that is almost frustratingly perfect. He was the ideal crusader, brave, chaste-eyed, and humble. But in the ruthless geopolitics of the Levant, perfect is a synonym for doomed. By dying so young, he remained a hero and avoided the inevitable corruption that comes with long rule. He became the marble statue that everyone admired but no one could emulate. However, his most significant act was involuntary. He left the throne empty, and nature as well as politics abhors a vacuum. By leaving no children, Godfrey cleared the path for his younger brother Baldwin. If Godfrey was the monk who guarded the temple, Baldwin was the robber baron who wanted to sell tickets at the door. The era of the advocate was over before it truly began. The era of the kings was about to dawn, and it would not be humble. It would be hungry. If Godfrey of Bouillon was the soul of the crusade, his younger brother Baldwin was its fist. When the news of Godfrey's death reached the city of Edessa in the summer of the year 1100, Baldwin did not waste time in mourning. He did not weep. He did not pray for days. He looked at the messenger, likely calculated the distance to Jerusalem, and immediately began packing his bags. This was a man who had already carved out his own county in Edessa by essentially bullying the local Armenian population into adopting him. Now the big prize was open, and Baldwin was not going to let something trivial like grief slow him down. The journey from Edessa to Jerusalem was not a victory lap. It was a gauntlet of death. The route was infested with Suris ambushes, and the Turkish rulers of Damascus were eager to mount the head of a Crusader prince on their walls. At the pass of the Dog River, near modern-day Beirut, Baldwin's small force was trapped. A lesser man would have negotiated or died. Baldwin fought with a ferocity that bordered on the demonic. He smashed through the ambush, scattering the enemy like dry leaves in a hurricane, proving to the Muslim world that a new, more dangerous animal had entered the ecosystem. When he arrived in Jerusalem in November, he found the gates barred, not by Muslims, but by his own priests. The Patriarch Damber, a man who loved power as much as he loved God, was frantically trying to turn the kingdom into a property of the church. He wanted Jerusalem to be a Vatican of the East. Baldwin simply ignored him. He had the knights, he had the swords. In the Middle Ages, he who held the steel held the seal. On Christmas Day in the year 1100, inside the ancient church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the charade ended. Baldwin did not kneel to receive the title of advocate or defender. He demanded the full, unadulterated title of Rex, King. This was a seismic shift. By crowning himself king, Baldwin was declaring that Jerusalem was no longer a spiritual colony. It was a sovereign state. It was a kingdom of this earth with all the blood, taxes, and politics that entailed. The choice of Bethlehem was also a masterstroke of cynicism. Since he could not be crowned in Jerusalem where Christ wore thorns, he went down the road to where Christ was born, creating a loophole that allowed him to wear gold without offending Ye pious ghosts of the past. Baldwin, I was a terrifying figure, tall, pale-skinned, with a dark beard that he eventually grew in the style of the locals. He looked like a statue of Mars brought to life. Unlike his brother, he was not chaste. He consumed women, wine, and territory with equal voracity. He was arrogant, yes, but he earned his arrogance. He understood what the pious Godfrey did not, that you cannot pray an enemy army away. You have to kill them. He brought real politics to the Holy Land, and he treated the crown not as a burden, but as a weapon. Under his gaze, the kingdom ceased to be a pilgrimage site and started to become an empire. He was ruthless, he was pragmatic, and he was exactly the kind of monster Jerusalem needed to survive the coming storm. Baldwin I was many things, but above all, he was a student of geography. He looked at his new kingdom and saw a terrifying reality. Jerusalem was an island, not an island surrounded by water, but an island surrounded by a sea of sand and hostility. To the north, the Turks of Damascus. To the south, the Fatimids of Egypt. To the east, the endless desert. The Crusaders were essentially a garrison trapped in a hostile fortress with no supply lines. They could pray for manna from heaven, but Baldwin knew that bread, arrows, and reinforcements had to come from Europe. And to get from Europe to Jerusalem, you needed ships. To dock ships, you needed harbors. The strategy was brutally simple: capture the coast or starve to death. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in amphibious warfare. Baldwin did not have a navy. The Crusaders were men of the horse and the lance. They looked at the sea with suspicion. So Baldwin made a deal with the only people who loved gold more than they feared hell: the merchant republics of Italy, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa. These were not holy warriors. They were the first Latinnational corporations of the Middle Ages. They did not crusade for salvation. They crusaded for profit margins. In the year 1101, the Genoese fleet arrived at the city of Caesarea. This was an ancient Roman metropolis, rich, fortified, and proud. Baldwin and the Genoese breached the walls on May 17th. What happened next was a massacre that would make the slaughter of Jerusalem look like a mere prelude. The citizens of Caesarea, terrified by the ironclad demons scaling their walls, fled to the great mosque for sanctuary. They believed that even these barbarians would respect the sanctity of a house of God. They were wrong. Baldwin's troops, urged on by the Genoese who were eager to loot, stormed the mosque. The chroniclers tell us that the floor of the prayer hall became a slippery lake of blood. The Crusaders butchered the men and enslaved the women. In a moment of supreme black comedy, the Genoese sailors, amidst the carnage, found a green glass bowl which they decided was the Holy Grail. They happily packed it up along with the gold, proving that religious relics are just another form of currency, if you have enough imagination. But the crown jewel was captured in the year 1104. Acre was the window to the world. It was the best natural harbor on the Levantine coast. Once Acre fell, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer a startup. It was a going concern. The city became a bustling hub where the spices of the east met the silver of the west. It became the lungs of the kingdom, breathing in money and breathing out war. However, this expansion came with a heavy price tag, one that would eventually bankrupt the monarchy's authority. The Italian fleets did not work for charity. In exchange for their ships and siege engines, Baldwin had to sign the devil's contract. He granted the Italians fully autonomous quarters in every city they helped capture. Imagine a kingdom. Here, the richest neighborhoods do not pay taxes to the king. In the Genoese quarter of an acre, the king's law did not apply. They had their own courts, their own markets, and their own weights and measures. They were a state within a state. Baldwin had solved his immediate problem of survival, but he had planted a cancer in the heart of his government. He had sold the future revenue of the kingdom to pay for its present porters. It was a classic short-term fix with long-term consequences. The king wore the crown, but the Italians held the purse strings. And as any student of history knows, he who holds the gold eventually gives the orders. If Baldwin was a lion on the battlefield, he was a wolf in the bedroom. But not in the romantic sense. For Baldwin, the sacrament of holy matrimony was treated with the same reverence a butcher treats a carcass, something to be chopped up, sold, and consumed for profit. To put it bluntly, the first king of Jerusalem was the most successful gold digger in the Middle Ages. He did not marry for love, he married for liquidity. His first victim was Armenia. When Baldwin was just a count in Odessa, struggling to control a rebellious population, he married Ara, an Armenian princess. It was a brilliant move to pacify the locals. Her dowry paid his troops, and her bloodline gave him legitimacy. But the moment Baldwin moved to Jerusalem and put on the crown, Ara became a liability. She was Armenian, not European. She was useful for a count, but embarrassing for a king. So, in a move of breathtaking callousness, Baldwin simply discarded her. He forced her into a convent in Jerusalem, claiming she had been unfaithful during her journey. There is a dark rumor that she had been raped by pirates on the way, and Baldwin, instead of comforting his wife, used the tragedy as a legal loophole to annul the marriage. He did not divorce her. He essentially decommissioned her like an old siege engine that was no longer needed. Ara eventually fled to Constantinople. Her life was ruined by the man she helped make a king, but the real masterpiece of his marital fraud was his third marriage to Adelaide del Vasto. By the year 1113, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was bankrupt. Constant war is expensive. Baldwin looked at the map and saw Sicily ruled by the wealthy widow Adelaide. She was old, she was rich, and she was desperate to be a queen. Baldwin proposed. Adelaide, blinded by the glitter of the crown, accepted. She sailed to Acre, bringing a dowry that was legendary. The chroniclers say her ships were laden with so much gold and silver that the economy of the Middle East fluctuated when she landed. Baldwin took the money, spent it on his army, and built his castles. But there was a small problem, a technicality that Baldwin had conveniently forgotten. He was still married to Ada. The church eventually caught up with him. The Pope was furious. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, realizing the king was a bigamist, demanded he separate from Adelaide. Baldwin, having already spent her money, suddenly developed a conscience. He agreed with the church. "Oh, what a terrible sin I have committed," he must have said, suppressing a grin. He annulled the marriage to Adelaide in the year 1117, and sent her back to Sicily. But he kept the money. Adelaide died shortly after, humiliated and broken. This was not just a marriage, it was a medieval Ponzi scheme. Baldwin viewed women not as partners, but as real estate assets to be acquired, leveraged, and liquidated. However, this scam had a long-term price. Adelaide's son was Roger II of Sicily. He grew up watching his mother die of shame. For the rest of his life, Roger hated the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a burning passion. When the Crusaders later begged Sicily for naval support, Roger spat in their face. Baldwin had secured his cash flow, but he had made an enemy of the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. When Baldwin died in the year 118, he left behind a kingdom that was expanding on the map, but rotting at the seams. The crown passed to his cousin Baldwin of Bouillon, who became Baldwin II. If the first Baldwin was a conqueror, the second was a fireman, constantly running from one blaze to another in a house that was slowly burning down. The reality of the Crusaders' precarious position hit home with terrifying force, just 1 year into his reign. In the year 1119, to the north of Jerusalem, the army of the Principality of Antioch, led by the reckless Roger of Salerno, rode out to meet the Turkish warlord Ilghazi. They did not wait for reinforcements. They did not scout the terrain. They rode into a trap so comprehensive that history remembers the location not by its geographic name, but by the result of the battle. Sanguinis, the field of blood. It was not a defeat, it was an erasure. 700 knights and 3,000 feet soldiers were surrounded and slaughtered to the last man. Roger of Salerno was found with a sword through his face. The massacre was so complete that for a moment the entire Crusader presence in the east teetered on the brink of extinction. The winds of the Levant smelled of iron and rotting meat. Baldwin II rushed north to save Antioch, but the psychological damage was done. The invincible image of the Frankish knight had been shattered. The roads to Jerusalem, once dangerous, were now death traps. Pilgrims traveling from the port of Jaffa to the Holy City were being robbed, kidnapped, and murdered with impunity by bandits and Bedouin raiders. The kingdom had a king, but it had no police force. The army was needed at the borders, leaving the internal arteries of the state wide open to infection. It was in this atmosphere of existential dread in the year 1119 that 2 French knights walked into the royal palace of Jerusalem. Their names were Hug de Pence and Godfrey de Santo. They were not great lords. They were not wealthy. In fact, they were so destitute that their later seal would depict 2 men riding on a single horse because they could not afford a spare. They approached Baldwin II with a proposal that sounded insane. They, along with 7 other relatives, wanted to form a brotherhood, but not a brotherhood of monks who prayed in silence, and not a brotherhood of knights who fought for loot. They wanted to be both. They proposed a new order of warrior monks dedicated solely to protecting pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. Baldwin II, desperate for any solution to his manpower crisis, did not laugh. He saw an opportunity. He granted them a headquarters in the southern wing of the royal palace, a structure built on top of the ruins of the ancient Jewish temple, which the Crusaders called the Temple of Solomon, and the Muslims called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Because of their location, these 9 poor knights became known as the Order of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Knights Templar. For the first 9 years, they were nobodies. They wore cast-off clothes and rode tired horses. But then they acquired a marketing manager, and not just any manager, but Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman in Christendom. Bernard was a theological genius and a master of propaganda. He realized that for the Templars to survive, he had to solve a fundamental religious paradox. How can a Christian commanded by Jesus to turn the other cheek be a professional killer? In his treatise in praise of the new knighthood, Bernard performed a feat of mental gymnastics that changed history. He argued that when a Templar kills a non-Christian, he is not committing homicide, the killing of a man. He is committing malicide, the killing of evil. By dehumanizing the enemy into an abstract concept of evil, Bernard gave the Templars a license to kill with a clear conscience. Killing was no longer a sin, it was a sacrament. Suddenly, donations poured in. The Templars went from wearing rags to owning castles, but their greatest invention was not on the battlefield. It was in the counting house. They invented modern banking. Here is how it worked. A pilgrim in Paris wanted to go to Jerusalem. If he carried gold, he would be robbed in France, or Italy, or Greece. So he would go to the temple in Paris, deposit his gold, and receive a piece of parchment, a letter of credit, encoded with a secret cipher. He could travel to the Holy Land with just a piece of paper in his pocket. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he would go to the temple there, hand over the paper, and withdraw his gold minus a transaction fee. It was the medieval equivalent of a traveler's check or an ATM network. The Templars became the wealthiest organization in the Western world. They owned a fleet of ships, managed massive estates, and lent money to kings and popes. They were the IMF, the CIA, and the U.S. Marine Corps rolled into one white-mantled package. Baldwin II had unwittingly created a monster. He needed a police force, but he ended up creating a multinational corporation that answered to no one but the Pope. They were the first standing army in the Holy Land, fanatic, disciplined, and terrifying. When they charged, they were forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. They were the iron spine of the kingdom. But as we shall see, a spine made of iron can sometimes be too rigid to bend, and when it breaks, it takes the whole body down with it. By the year 1129, King Baldwin II faced a problem that no amount of swordplay could solve: biology. He had 4 children, which was good. They were all daughters, which in the eyes of the 12th century, Rye patriarchy was a catastrophe. In the feudal system, a king's primary job description was not to sign treaties or cut ribbons. It was to put on 60 of iron and smash the skulls of the enemy. The medieval mind could not conceive of a woman leading a cavalry charge. To them, a kingdom without a male heir was like a body without a head, doomed to stumble and fall. Usually in such cases, the crown would pass to a nephew, a cousin, or the strongest male predator in the vicinity. But Baldwin II did something radical. He loved his eldest daughter, Melisende, and he recognized in her a steeliness that was lacking in many men. He decided that his bloodline would continue through the Dist side. He declared Melisende his heir, not merely as a placeholder for a future son, but as a ruler in her own right. However, Baldwin was a pragmatist. He knew that the sharks in the hot core and the wolves in Damascus would eat a lone woman alive. She needed a husband, but not just any husband. She needed a war dog. Baldwin looked to Europe and selected Fulk V, Count of Anjou. On paper, Fulk was perfect. He was wealthy. He was powerful. And he was a veteran crusader with a reputation for piety and violence. He was also the father of Godfrey of Anjou, which made him the grandfather of the future Plantagenet dynasty of England. This was a man with royal pedigree flowing through his veins, but there was a cultural chasm that Baldwin had underestimated. Fulk was a quintessential European aristocrat, arrogant, rigid, and convinced of his own superiority. When he arrived in the Holy Land in the year 1129, he behaved like a landlord inspecting a run-down property, inhabited by savages. He looked at the nobility of Jerusalem, the Pula, with disdain. To folk, these Franks of the East were strange. They bathed too often. They wore silk robes like the Arabs. They ate spiced food. And employed local Syrian doctors. Folk saw them as soft and corrupted. The locals in turn saw folk as a loud, unwashed barbarian who did not understand the subtle, deadly game of Levantine politics. The marriage between Melisende and Folk was not a union of hearts. It was a collision of worlds. Folk believed he was coming to be the king, with Melisende as his silent consort, a mere vessel to breed heirs. Melisende, raised in the shadow of the throne and trained by her father, believed she was the queen with Folk as her hired general. This fundamental misunderstanding was the spark that would ignite a civil war. Baldwin II died in 1131, thinking he had secured his daughter's future. In reality, he had locked her in a cage with a tiger. But what folk did not realize was that the fragile woman he had married was not a gazelle. She was a lioness who had simply not yet roared. The moment the old king was buried in the year 1131, folk of Anjou dropped the mask of the beautiful son-in-law and revealed the face of a tyrant. He did not view the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a joint venture. He viewed it as a hostile corporate takeover. In his mind, Melisende was merely the key that unlocked the door. Once inside, he intended to change the locks. Folk immediately began a systematic purge of the royal court. He fired the local nobility, the Pula, whom he considered soft and untrustworthy, and replaced them with his own men from Anjou. These were rough, arrogant French knights who treated the Holy Land like a conquered colony. For Melisende, this was not just a political insult, it was a personal erasure. Her father's trusted advisers were thrown into the street, and she found herself isolated in her own palace, a queen in title, but a prisoner in practice. Folk stopped consulting her on state matters. He signed decrees alone. He controlled the treasury. He was effectively telling the world, the blood of Baldwin no longer mattered. But folk made a classic error of the misogynist. He assumed that because Melisende was quiet, she was weak. He did not realize that in the viper pit of Jerusalem, silence is not submission. It is the sound of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment arrived in the form of a scandal involving Hugh of Jaffa. Hugh was the Count of Jaffa, the most powerful vassal in the kingdom. He was young, he was charismatic, he was incredibly handsome, and most importantly, he was Melisende's cousin. Hugh became the figurehead of the native resistance against folk's Anjava tyranny. He refused to bow to the new regime, and rumors began to circulate that he and the queen were excessively close. Folk, seeing an opportunity to destroy his wife's reputation and eliminate his political rival in one stroke, weaponized these rumors. He accused Hugh of treason and implicitly of adultery. Let us pause to appreciate the cynicism here. Historical evidence suggests the relationship between Hugh and Melisende was almost certainly platonic and political. But in the medieval Game of Thrones, the truth is irrelevant. The narrative is everything. By painting Melisende as and Hugh as a traitor, folk hoped to strip the queen of her moral authority. The drama escalated to a breaking point in 1134. Folk's stepson Walter of Caesarea publicly challenged Hugh to a trial by combat. This was not justice. It was a judicial murder execution. Hugh, knowing the deck was stacked against him, refused to show up. He was declared guilty in absentia and sentenced to exile for 3 years. It seemed folk had won, but then folk overplayed his hand. He got greedy. While Hugh of Jaffa was in Jerusalem preparing for his exile, playing a game of dice on the street, a Breton knight, a known associate of the king, lunged out of the shadows and stabbed him repeatedly. Hugh survived barely. The assassin was captured, and under the gentle persuasion of medieval torture, confessed that he had acted on the king's orders to restore peace. This was a PR disaster of biblical proportions. The public did not see a king dispensing justice. They saw a jealous petty gangster trying to murder a popular local hero in broad daylight. The streets of Jerusalem exploded in rage. The church, led by the patriarch, sided openly with Melisende. The army, disgusted by folks' dishonorable conduct, refused to follow him. Overnight, the power dynamic inverted. Folk found himself besieged in his own castle, not by an army, but by the sheer weight of public hatred. He looked around and realized he was completely alone. The soft queen he had tried to silence now held the loyalty of the entire kingdom. Terrified for his life and his crown, folk capitulated. He did not just apologize, he was politically castrated. The chronicler William of Tyre, writing with a delicious sense of irony, recorded the new reality of the court. From that day forward, the king became furious that he never attempted to take the initiative even in trivial matters. Without her knowledge and assistance, Melisende had won. She did not need to draw a sword. She let folk destroy himself with his own arrogance. For the rest of his reign, Fulk was essentially a trophy husband, a glorified general who rode the horse and wore the armor. While Melisende sat on the throne, managed the church, appointed the bishops, and ruled the kingdom of Jerusalem as its true and undisputed monarch. Under the iron grip of Baldwin I, Baldwin II, Jerusalem was a fortress. It smelled of wet horses, unwashed armor, and fear. But under Queen Melisende, the city began to smell of frankincense, saffron, and civilization. If her husband Fulk represented the brute force of the West, Melisende represented the seductive sophistication of the East. She understood something that the rough men of Europe did not. A kingdom is not built solely by stone walls. It is built by the culture that flourishes behind them. The era of Melisende is often called the Renaissance of Jerusalem. It was a brief golden afternoon where the kingdom stopped fighting for survival and started living for legacy. And the physical embodiment of this cultural fusion is a small, breathtaking object known as the Melisende Psalter. Created around the year 1135, this prayer book is not merely a religious text. It is a political manifesto bound in ivory and gold. It is the most beautiful object to survive from the Crusader states. And if you look closely at its pages, you can see the soul of Melisende herself. The cover consists of 2 ivory panels carved with Byzantine intricacy, depicting King David and the works of mercy. This was the influence of her mother, an Armenian princess raised in the orbit of Constantinople. The text inside is Latin written in the script of northern France, honoring her father and her husband. But the decorations, the initial letters, are illuminated not with European saints, but with Islamic geometric patterns, infinite interlacing knots that one would expect to find in a mosque in Cairo or Damascus, not a Christian prayer book. And this book was a scandal to the purists and a revelation to the pragmatists. It proved that Melisende was not a Frankish queen living in the East. She was a queen of the Levant. She was creating a new identity, the Prulan identity, a hybrid culture that took the strength of the West, the piety of Byzantium, and the artistry of Islam, and wove them into a single vibrant tapestry. This fusion extended from the pages of her book to the streets of her city. Under Melisende's patronage, Jerusalem was transformed. She poured money into the reconstruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, given it the Romanesque facade that tourists still photograph today. She built the Church of Saint, and a marvel of acoustics, where a single note sung by a choir lingers in the air for eternity. But to truly understand her reign, one had to walk through the triple market, the Malkasina. Here, in the covered bazaars built by the Queen, the lines of religious hatred were blurred by the universal language of commerce. For the first time since 1099, a Muslim merchant from Damascus could sell silk to a Jewish dyer from Tiberias, who would then sell the cloth to a Frankish knight from Normandy. It was not a modern democracy, and it was certainly not equality, but it was a pragmatic peace. Melisende realized that you cannot kill your neighbors forever if you want to buy their grain. The markets of Jerusalem bustled with a cacophony of languages: French, Greek, Arabic, Syriac. The smell of blood was replaced by the smell of roasting meat and exotic spices. This was Melisende's greatest victory. She proved that the kingdom of Jerusalem could be more than just a military outpost. It could be a home. She turned a colony of soldiers into a capital of culture. While her husband played at war, she was busy building a civilization that tragically would not survive the madness of her descendants. There is an old political axiom that says, "Power is not a baton passed in a relay race. It is a bone fought over by dogs." Queen Melisende had spent 20 years ruling Jerusalem, protecting the throne from her husband and the enemies at the gate, but she forgot that the cute blonde-haired boy she was protecting would eventually grow up. And when lions grow up, they want to lead the pride. By the year 1152, Baldwin III was 22 years old. He was tall, handsome, educated, and tired of asking his mother for permission to open the treasury, tired of the nobility looking past him to the queen whenever a decision needed to be made. In his eyes, he was a king in chains, and the jailer was his own mother. He demanded that Melisende step down and retire to a convent, the standard retirement home for inconvenient medieval women. Melisende, who had crushed her husband Falk 2 decades earlier, looked at her son and essentially said, no. She believed, with some justification, that Baldwin was too young and reckless to handle the complex web of alliances she had woven. The tension snapped in a moment of public humiliation. Baldwin planned a solemn procession in Jerusalem, wearing his crown, a symbol of his sole authority. Melisende simply forbade the patriarch from attending. A king without a priest is just a man in a funny hat. Furious, Baldwin did the unthinkable. He declared war on his mother. This was the Second Civil War of Jerusalem. But unlike the Cold War with folk, this was hot, kinetic warfare. Baldwin III launched a military campaign against his own capital. He captured the city of Nur, where Melisende's constable was holding out, then marched on the holy city itself. Imagine the scene. The citizens of Jerusalem looked up at the Tower of David, the citadel of the city, and saw their beloved queen barricaded inside. Down below in the streets was her son, the king, ordering siege engines to batter the walls. It was a Greek tragedy played out with French steel. The church tried to mediate, but Baldwin was relentless. He bombarded the tower until Melisende, realizing that destroying the city to save her pride was a victory for no one, agreed to negotiate. The resulting peace treaty was a testament to Melisende's enduring power. She lost Jerusalem, yes, but she was not executed. She was not exiled. She was not forced into a nunnery. Instead, she was given the city of Nablus as her personal fief. Nablus was not a consolation prize. It was a ministate. There, Melisende continued to rule with absolute authority, holding her own court and issuing her own decrees. And in a twist that reveals the complexity of their relationship, once Baldwin had secured the crown, he realized he still needed her. He frequently rode to Nablus to ask for her advice. The son who had besieged her tower now sat at her feet, realizing that, while he had the sword, she still had the map. Melisende died in the year 1161. Her legacy is singular in a region and an era dominated by testosterone, where women were traded like cattle to seal alliances. Melisende refused to be a pawn. She was the queen. She ruled not behind the scenes, but front and center. She proved that a woman could build a church, command an army, and break a king. She was the last true giant of the First Kingdom, and when she was buried in the valley of Josat, the golden age of Jerusalem was buried with her. For the first 40 years of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's existence, the Crusaders had benefited from a geopolitical miracle. Their enemies hated each other more than they hated the Christians. The Muslim world of the early 12th century was a shattered mirror, a collection of petty city-states ruled by squabbling emirs who were more interested in poisoning their brothers than in fighting the Franks. The Crusaders were essentially the lucky guests at a chaotic family dinner, stealing food from the table while the hosts were busy stabbing each other with forks. But in the year 1144, the party ended. From the north emerged a figure who would become the architect of the Crusaders' nightmares. Imagine Zengi the Atbeg of Mosul. Zengi was not a poet. He was a sledgehammer. He did not care for the polite rules of diplomacy. On Christmas Eve of the year 1144, while the Christian world was singing hymns, Zengi smashed through the walls of Edessa, the northernmost Crusader state. The fall of Edessa was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, a Crusader capital had been erased from the map. It proved that the Franks were not invincible. They were merely mortal men who bled when cut. This event triggered the humiliating failure known as the Second Crusade. But more importantly, it birthed a dynasty of vengeance. When Zengi was assassinated by his own slave, a fitting end for a tyrant, his son Nur-ad-Din took up the sword. But Nur-ad-Din was far more dangerous than his father. Zengi fought for territory. Nur-ad-Din fought for an idea. He realized that to defeat the invaders, he needed more than soldiers. He needed a unifying ideology. He dusted off an old concept, that had gathered dust in the libraries of theology. Jihad, holy war. Before Nuruddin, jihad was often interpreted as an internal spiritual struggle. Nuruddin weaponized it. He launched a massive propaganda campaign building madrasas, mosques and hospitals, all dedicated to a single narrative. The Franks are not just neighbors. They are a pollution that must be cleansed. He turned the war into a religious obligation. He united the desperate cities of Syria, Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul under the black banner of the Abbasids. Suddenly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer fighting a loose collection of warlords. It was facing a monolithic entity. The immune system of the Middle East had finally recognized the virus, and the fever was beginning to rise. The happy days of divide and conquer were over. The era of total war had begun. When Amalric took the throne in the year 1163 following the death of his brother, he did not look like the hero of a Shah d'Ist. He was not the golden-haired archetype of a Crusader prince. He was stout, heavy-set, with a chest like a wine barrel and a belly that strained the rivets of his chainmail. He had a speech impediment, a slight stammer that made him seem hesitant in conversation. To the superficial observer, he looked more like a well-fed tavern keeper than a warrior king. But behind that wheezing exterior lay the coldest, sharpest intellect ever to wear the crown of Jerusalem. Amalric was a mutant in the medieval Ganpool, a king who read books. While other knights spent their leisure time hawking or drinking, Amalric would retreat to his tent to study history and law. He was a skeptic in a land of fanatics, a man who once terrified his chronicler William of Tyre by questioning the resurrection of the body, a thought crime that could have sent a lesser man to the stake. He did not fight for glory. He fought for geometry. He looked at the map of the Middle East, not with religious fervor, but with the dispassionate eyes of a grandmaster looking at a chessboard. And what he saw terrified him. The geopolitical board had changed. To the north and east, Nur ad-Din had unified Syria into a wall of iron. Jerusalem was blocked, but to the south lay Egypt. In the 12th century, Egypt was the sick man of the Nile. Ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty that was rotting from the inside out, Egypt was wealthy beyond imagination, but militarily impotent. It was a dying whale floating in a sea of sharks, its belly full of gold and grain. Amalric understood the nutcracker theory of geopolitics before it even had a name. Jerusalem was the nut. If Nur ad-Din, the Sunni shark from the north, managed to conquer Egypt, the Shia whale in the south, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would be caught between the two jaws of a single massive empire. They would control the grain of the Nile to feed their armies and the gold of Cairo to pay their mercenaries. Jerusalem would be crushed. Therefore, Amalric concluded that the survival of the Crusader state depended on a single desperate axiom: we must eat the whale before the shark does. Egypt was not a prize for ambition. It was a necessity for survival. It was the key to the entire Middle East. If the Franks could take Cairo, they would cut the Islamic world in half and secure the resources to fight forever. If they failed, they were dead men walking. Between the years 1163 and 1169, the history of the Middle East condensed into a frantic, bloody race for a single prize. It was not a war of trenches. It was a war of movement. A deadly waltz danced along the banks of the Nile. The participants were Amalric of Jerusalem, the desperate king trying to secure his southern flank, and Asad ad-Din Sheru, the general of Nur ad-Din, a one-eyed, gluttonous, and terrifyingly competent Kurdish warlord. Riding in Sheru's shadow was his young, unassuming nephew, Yesef ibn Ob, whom the world would later know as Saladin. For 5 separate times, Ik marched his armies across the brutal Sinai Desert. 5 times he tried to unlock the gates of Egypt. The situation in Cairo was a farce of political instability. The Fatimid caliphs were mere puppets, children locked in golden cages, while the real power lay with the Grand Viziers, who murdered each other with alarming regularity. One such vizier, a survivor named Shor, played the Franks and the Syrians against each other like a master fiddler. When Sheru invaded, Shor called Amalric for help. When Amalric got too powerful, Shawa called Shiku. It was a triangle of betrayal where alliances shifted with the wind. But in the year 1168, Amalric, usually so calculating, lost his patience. He decided to stop playing the diplomat and start playing the conqueror. This was the moment the scholar king turned into a brute, and it cost him everything. He marched on the city of Bilbais, a key fortress in the Nile Delta. When the walls fell, Amalric did not show the restraint that had characterized his earlier campaigns. Perhaps he was frustrated by years of futility. Perhaps he wanted to send a message. Whatever the reason, he unleashed a massacre. The Christian army butchered the Muslim population of Bilbaisi, men, women, and children. It was a repetition of 1099, but in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The massacre of Bilbais was the greatest strategic blunder in the history of the Latin kingdom. Until that moment, the Coptic Christians of Egypt, and even many Shia Muslims, viewed the Franks as a potential shield against the Sunni extremists coming from Syria. But when the blood of Bilbaisi flowed into the Nile, public opinion in Egypt solidified instantly. Amalric had proven he was not a liberator, he was a monster. The Egyptians realized that Sheru and Saladin, despite being foreigners and Sunnis, were at least fellow Muslims. Amalric had effectively drove the sheep into the plough. Arms of the wolf. When Amalric marched on Cairo, he found a city ready to burn itself to the ground rather than surrender. The Vizier Shawa ordered the burning of Fust, the old capital. For 54 days, the smoke of the burning city darkened the sky, apocalyptic signal that the Franks would inherit nothing but ash. Facing a unified resistance and the approaching army of Sheru, Amalric had no choice. He retreated. He walked back across the Sinai, his dreams of a Nile empire turning to dust in his mouth. In January of 1169, Sheru entered Cairo as a conqueror. He executed the treacherous Shawa and declared himself vizier. But the gluttonous warlord did not enjoy his victory for long. 2 months later, after a particularly heavy meal, Sheru died of indigestion or perhaps a subtle poison. The stage was left empty for the young nephew. The Fatimid elites looked at Saladin, young, inexperienced, and seemingly quiet, and thought he would be a puppet they could control. They were wrong. Saladin ruthlessly consolidated power. He quietly dismantled the Fatimid Caliphate. On a Friday in September 1171, the name of the Fatimid Caliph was omitted from the prayers in the mosques of Cairo, replaced by the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. The Fatimid dynasty, which had ruled for 2 centuries, ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. Amalric's worst nightmare had come true. The shark had eaten the whale. Syria and Egypt were now united under the banner of the Ubids. The nutcracker had closed around Jerusalem, and the man holding the handle was Saladin. By the year 1174, the map of the Middle East, which for decades had been a mosaic of squabbling city-states, was now painted in a single, terrifying color, orbid yellow. Saladin was no longer just a general. He was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He controlled the Nile in the south and Damascus in the north. The kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer a player in the game of empires. It was a prisoner in a cell waiting for the executioner to turn the key. King Amalric, the man whose strategic brilliance had been undone by tactical hesitation, knew that the end was beginning. He spent his final months in a frenzy of diplomatic desperation, sending letters to the kings of Europe, begging for a new crusade. "Come quickly," he wrote, "for the walls are closing in." But Europe was tired. The kings of the West were busy fighting each other, and they had grown deaf to the boy who cried wolf from the Holy Land. And then biology delivered the final insult. In the summer of 1174, while campaigning in the north, Amalric drank water from a bad well. He contracted dysentery. For a king who had dreamed of conquering the Nile, it was a humiliating end to die from dirty water. On July 11th, the scholar king, the last great hope of the Latin East, shivered and died in his bed in Jerusalem. He was only 38 years old. The royal court gathered in the throne room, but there was no cheering for the new king. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence. They looked at the heir to the throne, and they felt a cold dread settle in their stomachs. The new king, Baldwin IV, was 13 years old. He was intelligent, he was brave, and he was beautiful with the blonde hair of his ancestors. But there was something wrong. The royal tutor, the historian William of Tyre, had noticed it first. When the young prince was playing with other children, they would pinch each other's arms to see who would cry. Baldwin never cried. He never felt pain in his right arm. The courtiers whispered in dark corners. They knew what that numbness meant. It was not just a medical condition in the medieval mind. It was a mark of divine judgment. It was the dragon leprosy. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, surrounded by the greatest military genius of the Islamic world, was now to be led by a child whose body was slowly rotting while he was still alive. The shock was at the gate, and the captain of the ship was dying by inches. The stage was set for the ultimate tragedy. It began as a game, as most tragedies do. The year was 1170. In the royal nursery of Jerusalem, the young Prince Baldwin, then just 9 years old, was playing with the sons of the nobility. The game was simple, brutal, and typically medieval. The boys would pinch each other's arms with their fingernails, digging in deep to see who would cry out first. It was a test of endurance, a way for future knights to harden themselves against pain. The other boys shrieked, pulled away, and nursed their bruises. But Baldwin did not. He sat there smiling, his arm a lattice of red marks, completely silent. Watching from the corner was the Archdeacon William of Tyre, the boy's tutor, and one of the most brilliant minds of the 12th century. At first, William thought the prince was displaying supreme stoicism, a trait of a great king. But as he watched the fingernails dig deeper into the royal flesh without even a flinch, admiration turned to a cold, creeping horror. William approached the boy. He rolled up the prince's sleeve. He pinched the right arm, then the hand. Nothing. No reflex, no pain. The limb was as numb as wood. William felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He knew the symptoms. Every man in the Middle East knew the symptoms. It was the disease that God used to punish the wicked, the disease that turned men into monsters, leprosy. The diagnosis was a death sentence, not just for the boy, but for the dynasty. In the 12th century, leprosy was not understood as a bacterial infection. It was viewed as a curse, a sign of moral corruption rotting the soul from the inside out. And yet here it was consuming the innocent heir to the holy city. When the news reached the haute court, the reaction was a mixture of revulsion and ruthless political calculus. The barons looked at the 13-year-old boy, and they did not see a victim. They saw a liability. A leper king could not marry. He could not produce heirs. He would rot, he would weaken, and he would die young. In the shark tank of Jerusalem, a weak king was blood in the water. Whispers began to circulate in the dark corridors of the palace. Depose him, they said. Lock him away in a lazaretto with the other unclean souls, and crown his sister Sibylla. But the High Court had underestimated the loyalty of the people and the sheer will of the boy himself. On July 15, 1174, the 75th anniversary of the conquest of the city, Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sailor. It was the most heartbreaking coronation in history. There was no joy in the cathedral that day, only a suffocating solemnity. As the heavy gold crown was placed on his head, the courtiers averted their eyes. They were looking at a child who was already a ghost. To hide the early signs of the disease, the lesions beginning to mar his angelic face, the young king was often heavily veiled. Or as legend and cinema would have us believe, he began to wear a mask. Imagine the scene. A 13-year-old boy standing alone before the altar of God, surrounded by powerful men who wanted him gone, while his own body was eating itself alive. Underneath the silk and the gold, he was numb to the touch. But his spirit was agonizingly alive. He knew he was dying. He knew he was repulsive to his subjects, but as he grasped the scepter with a hand that could not feel it, Baldwin made a silent vow. He would not be the king who rotted in the dark. He would be the king who burned bright before the end. To understand Baldwin IV, we must first understand the monster that lived inside his blood. Leprosy, or Ha. Ensign's disease is a slow, sadistic assassin. It does not kill you quickly. It dismantles you piece by piece like a cruel child pulling the wings off a fly. The horror begins with anesthesia. The nerves die first. Baldwin likely felt nothing when he touched a hot goblet or a sharp blade. But this numbness was not a blessing. It was a trap. Without pain to warn him, infections festered unnoticed. Then came the visible decay. By his late teens, the face of the king, once described as beautiful, had begun to collapse. The cartilage of the nose disintegrated. The skin ulcerated. His eyes, attacked by the bacteria, slowly clouded over until the world faded into a gray, permanent mist. He was going blind, forced to rule a kingdom he could no longer see. But the most devastating loss for a medieval warrior was his hands. A king must hold a sword. A king must hold the reins of a warhorse. Baldwin watched in silent horror as his fingers curled into useless claws, and then, one by one, gangrene set in. He eventually lost the use of both hands and feet. He could not walk. He had to be carried in a litter. He could not ride. He had to be strapped onto his saddle like a sack of grain. The stench of his own rotting flesh was so overpowering that his attendants had to burn strong incense just to stand in the same room with him. He was a living corpse, a decomposing object wrapped in royal silk. And yet herein lies the supreme paradox of his reign. As his body withered, his spirit hardened into diamond. Why did he not abdicate? It would have been the logical, humane choice. The Order of St. Lazarus existed specifically for Leperites. He could have retired there to die in peace and prayer. The Wart Corps certainly wanted him to, but Baldwin refused because Baldwin believed in the divine right of kings in its most terrifyingly literal sense. He believed that God had made him king and Ode had made him a leper. The two were inseparable. To abdicate would be to reject the cross that Christ had commanded him to carry. He saw his suffering not as a disqualification, but as a credential. Who better to defend the Holy Sealer than a man who was already living his own passion? Who better to understand the suffering of Christ than a man whose hands were pierced not by nails but by disease? There was also a fierce, defiant spite in him. The world looked at him with pity and revulsion. The Muslims called him the pig. His own courtiers looked at him as a mistake of nature. Baldwin remained on the throne to prove them all wrong. Every day he sat upright was an act of rebellion against his biology. Every time he mounted a horse, tying his ruined body to the animal, he was screaming at the universe that the spirit is stronger than the flesh. He ruled for 11 years 11 years of agony. He governed a fractured kingdom, checked the ambition of Saladin, and held the fractious barons together by the sheer force of his will. He forced men who were healthy, strong, and arrogant to bow before a man who could not even wipe his own face. In the end, Baldwin IV proved that kingship is not about the strength of the arm. It is about the weight of the soul. In the autumn of the year 1177, Saladin made the only catastrophic mistake of his illustrious career. He looked at the map of Jerusalem, and then he looked at the intelligence reports regarding its king. He saw a 16-year-old boy rotting alive, barely able to hold the reins of a horse, commanding a kingdom on the verge of civil war. Saladin, the eagle of Egypt and Syria, saw prey. He did not see a predator. And so Saladin did not just invade. He went on a leisurely stroll of conquest. He marched out of Egypt with 26,000 men, a massive juggernaut of cavalry, infantry, and siege engineers. This was an extinction-level event for the Latin kingdom. He bypassed the fortress of Gaza, brushed aside the Templars, and headed straight for Jerusalem. He was so confident, so utterly convinced of his own invincibility, that he allowed his army to spread out. His soldiers broke formation to pillage the countryside, filling their sacks with Christian gold and their bellies with Christian grain. They moved slowly like a fat python that has already swallowed its meal. But Baldwin IV was not cowering in his palace. When he heard the news, The Leper King did not summon a council. He summoned his horse. He scraped together every able-bodied man he could find. The numbers were pathetic. He had 375 knights and perhaps a few thousand infantry. He was outnumbered nearly 5-1. Baldwin broke out of the blockade at Ascalon and rode north, hugging the coast, moving with a desperate speed that defied his physical condition. He linked up with 80 Templar knights led by the Grand Master Odo de Santa Ald, a man as hard and unforgiving as the stone of the Holy Sephila. Together they had barely 500 heavy cavalry, 500 men against the wrath of the Islamic world. On the afternoon of November 25, 1177, near the hill of Mont Gartel el Jaza, the two armies made visual contact. The scene was cinematic in its terrifying disparity. Saladin's army was a sea of yellow banners and steel stretching as far as the eye could see. They were crossing a muddy ravine, disorganized, tired, and weighed down by loot. Suddenly, they looked up to the ridge and saw the silhouette of the Christian army against the afternoon sun. Panic rippled through the Muslim ranks. They were caught with their pants down, but Saladin was a veteran. He began to bark orders, trying to wheel his massive army around to crush this tiny insect that dared to challenge him. On the Christian side, there was silence. The knights looked at the ocean of enemies, and I knew they were looking at their own death. Fear, cold and gripping, began to take hold. It was then that Baldwin IV did something that transcended warfare and entered the realm of myth. The king, whose body was a wreck of bandages and sores, dismounted from his horse. He called for the Bishop of Bethlehem to bring forward the true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, a piece of wood believed to be from the very crucifix of Jesus. Baldwin fell to his knees in the mud before the cross. He did not pray with the dignity of a king. He wept with the desperation of a dying child. He raised his bandaged hands that could no longer feel the wood they touched, toward heaven. He screamed out to God, asking not for his own life, for he knew that was forfeit, but for the life of his kingdom. The sight of their broken, weeping king, a boy suffering the pains of hell on earth, yet refusing to yield, electrified the army. The fear evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, holy fury. They were no longer fighting for land. They were fighting for him. Baldwin was helped back onto his horse. His hands were strapped to the rest because he could not grip them. He drew his sword or had it tied to his hand and pointed it at the center of the enemy line. The charge of Montgard was like a thunderclap. 500 knights forming a solid wedge of iron slammed into Saladin's center. The impact was geological. The heavy Frankish war horses bred for exactly this kind of shock warfare smashed through the light Tsar armor like a hammer through glass. The Templars, led by Odo, fought like demons. They did not stop to duel. They rode straight for the yellow banner of the Sultan. They cut through the Mamluk bodyguards, the elite slave soldiers of Saladin, as if they were wheat. Saladin watched in horror as his invincible army dissolved into chaos. The surprise was total. The narrow terrain prevented him from using his superior numbers, and the ferocity of the Crusader charge broke the will of his men. The invincible army turned and ran. It became a slaughter. The Crusaders chased them into the twilight. As night fell, a violent thunderstorm broke out, turning the dry wadis into raging rivers of mud. The Muslim soldiers fleeing in the dark were bogged down. Their horses slipped, their carts overturned. The Bedouins of the desert, seeing the tide turn, emerged from the shadows to slit the throats of the stragglers and loot the lutters. Saladin, the greatest conqueror of his age, barely escaped with his life. He had to abandon his army, his treasure, and his dignity. He fled into the night on a racing camel, accompanied by only a handful of guards, riding so hard that he did not stop until he reached Egypt. He had arrived as a lion. He returned as a whipped dog. Baldwin IV had achieved the impossible. The Leper King had defeated the eagle. It was the greatest military upset of the Middle Ages, but as the young king rode back to Jerusalem, his body racked with the pain of exertion, the bandages on his hands soaked with blood and sweat. He knew that this was not a victory. It was a reprieve. He had bought Jerusalem a few more years of life, but the price was his own acceleration toward the grave. The victory at Montesard was a miracle, but miracles in the real world come with a heavy tax. For Baldwin IV, the exertion of that battle accelerated his decay. The adrenaline faded and the bacteria surged. By the year 1180, the king was no longer the boy who rode a horse with bandaged hands. He was a wreck. The leprosy had claimed his eyes. The world had dissolved into a permanent milky darkness. He could no longer see the maps he studied or the enemies he fought. He could only hear the whispers of his courtiers, and what he heard was the sound of vultures circling a dying animal. His body was covered in ulcerating sores that refused to heal. He lost the use of his limbs entirely. When he moved, he had to be carried on a litter, like a religious icon. But the true tragedy of Baldwin's final years was not the rot of his flesh. It was the rot of his court. As the king's physical power waned, the vacuum was filled by two opposing factions who hated each other more than they hated Saladin. On one side were the Doves, led by Raymond III of Tripoli. Raymond was the adult in the room. He was fluent in Arabic. He understood the mind of Saladin, and he realized that the kingdom's only hope for survival lay in diplomacy and calculated trusses. He represented the native barons, the men who wanted to live in the East, not just die there. On the other side were the hawks, the newcomers, the fanatics and the opportunists. Their leaders were the chaotic Real Desat and the vacuous guy of Lucino. To them, peace was treason. They viewed the Muslims not as neighbors to be managed, but as targets to be destroyed. They had the fervor of the First Crusade, but none of its competence. Caught in the middle was the blind, dying king. He knew that Raymond was right, but he was bound by blood and feudal lord to his family. His sister, Sibylla, the heir to the throne, had fallen in love with Guy of Lusignan. History has rarely produced a character as frustrating as Guy. He was beautiful, he was charming, and he was utterly, catastrophically incompetent. Baldwin knew this. He called Guy a fool to his face. But, in a moment of weakness or perhaps exhaustion, Baldwin allowed the marriage. In 1180, Sibylla married Guy and the fate of Jerusalem was sealed with a kiss. The consequences were immediate. Baldwin, too sick to rule, appointed Guy as regent. It was a disaster. When Saladin invaded in 1183, Guy commanded the largest army Jerusalem had ever assembled. Yet he refused. To fight, he was paralyzed by indecision. The blind king, furious at this cowardice, had himself carried to the front lines on a litter to relieve the siege of Kerak. Imagine the shame of Guy of Lusignan, a healthy warrior in shining armor being relieved of command by a blind, rotting man being carried on a stretcher. In his final months, Baldwin tried desperately to undo his mistake. He tried to annul Sibylla's marriage. He tried to bar Guy from the succession. He even crowned his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin IV, as co-king, forcing the barons to swear allegiance to a child just to keep Guy away from the throne. It was the desperate thrashing of a man trying to hold back the tide with broken hands, but it was too late. The court was fractured. The hawks were provoking Saladin at every turn, breaking trusses and slaughtering caravans, while the doves watched in horror as the countdown to doomsday ticked away. Baldwin lay in his bed, listening to the arguments, the shouting, the sharpening of knives. He knew what was coming. He had held the door shut for a decade, but his strength was gone. In March of the year 1185, Baldwin IV finally found peace. He died in Jerusalem, surrounded by the stone walls he had defended with such superhuman will. He was 24 years old. His death was not a tragedy. It was a release. For 11 years, his soul had been trapped in a cage of decaying meat. Now he was free. But for the kingdom of Jerusalem, his death was the removing of the keystone. The arch was about to collapse. As they lowered his body into the tomb near Golgotha, the people of the city wept, not just for their king, but for themselves. They knew that the shield was broken. The eagle of Egypt was watching, and there were no more miracles left in the Holy Land. History has a cruel sense of irony. It often follows a tragedy with a farce. If Baldwin IV was the tragedy of a great soul tra, PPTS, in a ruined body, then what followed was the fire of beautiful bodies containing ruined souls. In the year 1186, after the premature death of the child King Baldwin I, the throne of Jerusalem was left vacant. It was a power vacuum that sucked in the most disastrous couple in the history of the Crusades, Sibylla and Guy of Lucin. Sibylla was the sister of the Leper king. She had the blood of the royal line, but she also had a fatal flaw. She was hopelessly, blindly in love with Guy. And who was Guy? He was a French knight from Poitou, possessing the kind of stunning physical beauty that makes people forget he had the strategic intelligence of a root vegetable. He was a man so vacuous that his own brother Geoffrey once remarked, "If this guy becomes a king, I might as well become God." The High Court of Jerusalem knew this. They knew Guy was weak, indecisive, and easily manipulated. So when Sibylla demanded the crown, the barons made her swear a solemn oath. They agreed to crown her on one condition: she must divorce Guy. They assured her she could choose a new husband, anyone she wanted, as long as it was not the fool from Lucino. Sibylla, proving she was smarter than the barons but foolish in love, agreed. On the day of her coronation in 1186, the patriarch placed the crown on her head. Then he invited her to choose her new consort to reign as king. The entire court held its breath, expecting her to pick a powerful baron like Baldwin of Bouillon. Instead, Sibylla stood up, turned to the crowd, and called forth Guy of Lucino. She placed the crown on his head and declared, "I choose Guy as my husband and my king. What God has joined, let no man put asunder." It was a master stroke of political theatre, but it was a death sentence for the kingdom. The room erupted in chaos. The most experienced barons walked out in disgust. Baldwin of Bouillon, a veteran who had bled for the kingdom for decades, looked at the new king and delivered a line that summarized the despair of the old guard. He said, "If Guy is king, I would rather be a donkey herder." He refused to serve, abandoned his thieves, and left for Antioch. The kingdom had a head, but it had lost its brain. But a weak king is only half the recipe for disaster. You also need a madman to light the fuse. Enter Reynaud de Chassin. If Guy was incompetent, Rield was a psychopath. The lord of ultra-order, Rield was a rogue element, a man who viewed treaties as toilet paper. He controlled the mighty fortress of Kerak, which sat like a vulture overlooking the trade routes between Egypt and Damascus. While Saladin was respecting the truce he had signed with the late Leper king, Raoul was bored. In the winter of 1186, a massive Muslim caravan, rich with spices and gold, passed near Kerak. It was accompanied by armed guards, but they were under the protection of the truce. Reynaud did not care. He descended upon them like a wolf. He slaughtered the guards, stole the goods, and threw the merchants into his dungeons. When the prisoners reminded him of the truce, Reynaud laughed and spat, "Ask your Muhammad to come and save you." But he did not stop there. Reynaud launched pirate ships into the Red Sea, sinking pilgrim vessels and threatening to march on Mecca itself to destroy the Ka and dig up the Prophet's bones. This was not war. This was sacrilege. News of the atrocity reached Damascus. Saladin, who had shown remarkable restraint for years, finally snapped. The insult to the Prophet was the red line. He swore a personal oath before God that he would kill Real Dashio with his own hands. The truce was dead. The jihad was proclaimed. The destructive couple sat on the throne, unaware that the madman in Kerak had just invited the apocalypse to come for dinner. In the scorching July of 1187, the Hat in the Galilee was not merely weather. It was a weapon. The sun beat down on the limestone hills, turning the air into a shimmering oven. Saladin knew this terrain better than he knew the lines of his own hand. He also knew his enemy. He knew that the Crusader army was a heavy, ironclad beast that required massive amounts of water to survive. If he could lure them away from their springs into the barren, waterless plateau, The sun would kill them before a single arrow was fired. On July 2nd, Saladin spun the trap. He crossed the Jordan River and laid siege to the city of Tiberias. Inside the citadel was a Shiva of Buris, the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli. Saladin did not storm the citadel immediately. He attacked it just enough to send a panic signal. He was dangling the bait. He was essentially saying to the king of Jerusalem, "Come and get me." The Crusader army was camped at the springs of Sepharis. It was a perfect defensive position. Plenty of water, grazing for the horses, and unassailable ground. If they stayed there, Saladin would eventually have to withdraw, as his own army could not stay in the field indefinitely. That night, the War Council of Jerusalem gathered in the king's tent. It was the most consequential meeting in the history of the Crusades. The atmosphere was thick with sweat, testosterone, and hatred. Raymond of Tripoli spoke first. He was the most experienced commander in the room. His own wife was the one being besieged. By all rights, he should have been the one screaming for a rescue mission. But Raymond was a realist. He stood up and delivered a speech of chilling pragmatism. He argued that Tiberias was too far. The road was a waterless wasteland. To march across it in July was suicide. Let Tiberias fall. Raymond reportedly said, "I would rather lose my city and my wife than lose the entire kingdom. If we stay here, Salad, it must retreat. If we march, we are dead men." The logic was irrefutable. Even Guy of Lucenor, who usually struggled with complex thoughts, saw the wisdom in it. The council agreed they would stay put. They would let Saladin bang his head against the walls while they drank cool water in the shade. The meeting adjourned, but the night was long, and the devil never sleeps. After the barons had gone to bed, Gerard Deadfort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, crept into King Guy's tent. Gerard hated Raymond. He viewed Raymond's caution as cowardice, or worse, treason. He whispered poison into the weak king's ear. "Do you hear how he speaks?" Gerard hissed. "He is willing to sacrifice his own wife because he is in league with Saladin. If you do not march, sire, the soldiers will say you are a coward. They will say you are afraid of the Sarus. The Templars will not follow a coward." This was Guy's Achilles' heel. He was deeply insecure. He knew he was king only because of his wife. He was terrified of being seen as weak. The accusation of cowardice was a knife in his gut. Gerard played him like a fiddle, manipulating his ego and his fear. In the darkness of that tent, Guy of Lucenor made the decision that would doom the Christian East. He reversed the council's decision. He ordered the trumpets to sound at dawn. When the sun rose on July 3rd, Raymond of Tripoli heard the order to march. He reportedly cried out, "Ah, Lord God, the war is over. We are dead men. The kingdom is finished." The army of Jerusalem, 20,000 men, the largest force the kingdom had ever assembled, left the safety of the springs and marched into the furnace. They were walking into a kill zone. They carried little water. They wore heavy chain mail. And as they crested the hills, they saw Saladin's army waiting for them. Not with fear, but with a predatory smile. The trap had snapped shut. On the M. Morning of July 4th, 1187, the sun rose over the hills of Galilee, not as a bringer of light, but as an executioner. The Crusader army was trapped on a dry volcanic plateau known as the Horns of Hattin. They were surrounded. They were exhausted. But above all, they were thirsty. Thirst is a primal horror. It strips away humanity faster than any sword. The men of Jerusalem had not drunk water for 24 hours. Encased in heavy chainmail and padded gambesons, they were essentially being cooked alive in their own sweat. Their tongues were swollen black and cracked like dry leather. Below them, shimmering in the heat haze, lay the blue waters of the Sea of Galilee. It was a cruel mirage, so close they could see the waves, yet separated from them by a wall of Muslim steel. Saladin, observing the misery of his enemy from his cool, shaded pavilion, decided to turn the screw. He ordered his men to set fire to the dry scrub and grass that covered the hillside. The wind was blowing towards the Crusaders. Suddenly, A wall of choking black smoke rolled over the Frankish lines. The heat of the sun was now joined by the heat of the fire. The Crusaders were blinded, coughing, their lungs filling with ash. It was no longer a battle. It was a simulation of hell. The discipline of the army collapsed. The infantry, maddened by thirst, abandoned the knights and scrambled up the rocky slopes of the horns, hoping to find a breeze or a drop of moisture. They were cut down by waves of arrows that darkened the sky like a swarm of locusts. The knights, the pride of Christendom, were left alone. Their horses, crazed by thirst, collapsed under them. In the center of this apocalypse stood the red tent of King Guy and the true cross. The Bishop of Acre held the sacred relic aloft, hoping for a miracle. But God was not looking at Hattin that day. The Muslim cavalry charged. The bishop was killed. The true cross, the holiest object in the Christian world, fell. It was seized by Saladin's troops and paraded upside down. When the soldiers saw the cross fall, the last vestige of their spirit broke. The kingdom of Jerusalem effectively died in that moment. King Guy, along with his brother, the chaotic Ral de Shashin, and the grand masters of the military orders, surrendered. The slaughter ceased. The silence that followed was broken only by the groans of the dying and the calls to prayer from the victors. The final act of this tragedy took place in the tent of Saladin. The Sultan sat quietly, his face unreadable. He ordered the prisoners to be brought before him. King Guy was trembling, his lips parched, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who expects to be flayed alive. Reynold de Shashin, however, stood tall, defiant, and arrogant to the end. Saladin, seeing the king's condition, ordered a goblet of iced water, rose water chilled with snow brought from Mount Hermon to be given to Guy. In the Arab tradition of hospitality, this was a sacred gesture. If a prisoner eats or drinks with his captor, his life is safe. Guy drank greedily, the cold liquid shocking his system. Then, in a fatal breach of etiquette, he passed the cup to Reynaud. Saladin's eyes narrowed. He spoke to the interpreter. "Tell the king, it is he who gives this man to drink, not I." The distinction was a death sentence. Saladin had sworn a vow to kill Reynaud for his attacks on the pilgrims and his threats against Mecca. He stood up, drew his scimitar, and confronted the Lord of Kerak. "I have warned you twice," Saladin said. "Once when you broke the truce, and once when you insulted the prophet." Reynaud sneered. Saladin struck. The blade bit into Reynaud's shoulder. The guards dragged the screaming baron out of the tent and severed his head. King Guy, watching the blood pool on the carpets, fell to his knees, shaking violently. He believed he was next. Saladin approached him, sheathed his sword, and helped the terrified king to his feet. With a voice that was both chilling and comforting, he delivered one of the most famous lines in medieval history. A king does not kill a king. But that man, he had passed the bounds. Outside the tent, the head of Real de Shashin was being dragged through the camp. Inside, Guy of Lusignan lived, but he was a king of nothing. The army was gone, the cross was gone, and the road to Jerusalem lay wide open. After Hattin, Jerusalem was a city of ghosts and widows. There were almost no soldiers left to man the walls, only terrified refugees, weeping women, and priests praying for a miracle that would not come. Into this vacuum stepped Baldwin of Ibelin, a nobleman who had survived the slaughter. He had come to the city only to retrieve his wife and children, but the people, seeing a leader, begged him to stay. Baldwin, initially reluctant, accepted the burden of command. He looked at the defense and realized the absurdity of his position. He had a city of stone, but no men of iron. In a desperate act of improvisation, Baldwin gathered all the squires and merchant sons, boys as young as 16, and knighted 60 of them in a mass ceremony. It was a gesture of defiance. He could not give them skill, but he gave them dignity. When Saladin arrived on September 20th, 1187, he expected a quick surrender. Instead, he found a city ready to bite. The siege lasted nearly 2 weeks, but when the walls were finally breached, Baldwin rode out to meet the Sultan, not to beg, but to threaten. He told Saladin that if the Christians were not given honorable terms of surrender, they would kill their own families, burn their wealth, execute the 5,000 Muslim prisoners inside the city, and destroy the Dome of the Rock. "We will leave you nothing but a pile of stones and sand," Bouillon warned. Saladin, who wished to liberate the holy city, not inherit a graveyard, agreed. A ransom was set for every man, woman, and child. Those who could pay would leave. Those who could not would be enslaved. On October 2nd, 1187, the gates opened. The contrast with 1099 could not have been more stark. When the first Crusaders entered, they waded in blood up to their ankles. When Saladin entered, there was no massacre. There was no looting. He placed guards on the streets to prevent reprisals. He even paid the ransom for thousands of poor Christians out of his own pocket. The crescent moon rose once again over the Tower of David. The churches were converted back into mosques, washed with rosewater to cleanse the impurity of the Frankish rule. The kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen, not with a bang, but with a weary sigh. The first kingdom was over, but the wars of the cross were far from finished. The news of the fall would soon reach Europe, and a new set of kings, a lion-y heart, a one-eyed German, and a cunning Frenchman would pick up the sword. The first kingdom of Jerusalem lasted for 88 years, from that bloody July morning in 1099 to the weary capitulation in 1187. In the grand sweep of history, 88 years is a heartbeat. It is less than the lifespan of a modern human. Yet this brief, violent experiment left a scar on the face of the Middle East that has never fully healed, and a legacy of stone that has never crumbled. The political entity that Godfrey built and Baldwin defended was destroyed. But the physical footprint of the Crusaders remains the most imposing feature of the Levantine landscape. Their most enduring legacy is architecture. The Crusaders were masters of stone. They dotted the hills of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, with castles that were centuries ahead of their time. The crown jewel of this legacy is the Crac des Chevaliers. Crac des Chevaliers. It is not just a fortress. It is a machine of war perfected in masonry. With its concentric walls, massive tailor slopes, and murder holes, it represents the pinnacle of military engineering. It was so formidable that even Saladin, at the height of his power, looked at its walls and decided to keep walking. It stands today as a silent sentinel, a reminder of a time when a few hundred knights could hold back an empire. But their legacy is also religious. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom, is largely a Crusader construction. Before 1099, the site was a confusing collection of small chapels and ruins. The Crusaders unified them under a single Romanesque roof, adding the bell tower and the facade that millions of pilgrims see today. When a modern tourist walks through the old city of Jerusalem, they are walking through a street plan laid out by Frankish engineers. They are seeing the city through the eyes of Melisende. Culturally, the legacy is more complex and subtle. The First Kingdom gave birth to a unique hybrid society, the Pula. These were the Pulani, the descendants of the original Crusaders who were born in the East. Unlike their grandfathers who arrived with blood in their eyes, the Pulas spoke Arabic, ate spiced foods, wore turbans, and employed Syrian doctors. They were the bridge between two worlds that refused to touch. Commercial trade flourished in this blood-soaked soil. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, used the Crusader ports to create the first global trade network since the fall of Rome. Sugar, spices, silk, and glass flowed into Europe, changing the Western palate and economy forever. The Crusades ironically civilized Europe by introducing it to the sophistication of the East, even as they tried to destroy it. The First Kingdom was a paradox, a state founded on fanaticism, but susta, ined by trade, a society built on war, but defined by the art of fortification. It was a dream of heaven that turned into a reality of earth and stone. And as Saladin's call to prayer echoed over the reconquered city, the stone remained stubborn and immovable, a testament to the men who had come from the edge of the world to die for an empty tomb. The rise and fall of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem is not merely a chronicle of battles. It is a timeless study on the nature of hubris, that blinding, toxic arrogance that convinces men they are gods. The Crusaders arrived in the Levant believing they possessed a divine mandate. They believed that because they fought for the cross, the laws of logistics, geography, and politics did not apply to them. They mistook luck for destiny. This fanaticism was their greatest strength, but ultimately their fatal flaw. It drove Baldwin IV to victory at Mulgisa, but it also drove Guy of Lucenor to march into the desert at Hattin. They forgot the most fundamental lesson of history. Faith can move mountains, but it cannot create water in a desert, nor can it turn a fool into a king. When Reynald de Chatil taunted the prophet, he was not just insulting a religion, he was challenging the very fabric of reality, believing himself untouchable. The desert, indifferent to his titles, swallowed him whole. The philosopher Shelley wrote of Ozymandias, a king whose statue lies broken in the sand, a testament to the futility of power. The kingdom of Jerusalem is a similar ruin. It teaches us the crushing weight of impermanence. For 88 years, men killed, schemed, and died to possess a patch of dry earth. They built walls of stone meant to last forever. But in the end, the Latin kingdom was just a tenant, and the lease had expired. Today, the sun still rises over the Judean hills. The olive trees still grow in Gethsemane. The call to prayer and the Rin. Ging of bells still echo in the valley. Jerusalem is still there, indifferent, beautiful, and eternal. But Godfrey, Baldwin, Saladin, and Guy the giants who shook the earth are nothing but dust, blown away by the same wind that erases their footprints from the sand. The sun had set on the kingdom of Jerusalem, but the darkness would not last forever. When the news of the fall of the Holy City reached Europe, it did not cause despair. It caused an earthquake. Pope Urban III, upon hearing the report of Hattin, was said to have died of grief on the spot. But from his ashes, a fire was kindled. The kings of the West stopped their petty squabbles. The shockwave of 1187 united Christendom in a cry for vengeance. From the misty forests of Germany came the terrifying Emperor Frederick Barbarossa with an ocean of ironclad knights. From the courts of Paris came the cunning Philip Augustus. And from the island of England came a man whose name would echo through history louder than any other. A man who was not a king but a force of nature. A warrior poet who feared neither god nor devil. Richard the Lion he heart. Saladin has defeated the politicians, the lepers, and the fools. But the prologue is over. The main event is about to begin. The eagle of the East is about to face the lion of the West. The third crusade, the Crusade of Kings, is coming, and the sands of the Levant are about to turn red once more. The journey of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem has come to an end, but the War of the Titans is just beginning. If you were captivated by the resilience of the Leper King or the unstoppable rise of Saladin, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us which character impressed you the most. Make sure to smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now because you do not want to miss the next chapter. The legendary showdown between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, where tactics, courage, and brutality reach their absolute peak. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. I will see you in the coming storm.